A shadow 6 meters wide sweeps across the tall grasses of the Argentine pampa, and for a moment, the world goes silent. This isn't the fleeting silhouette of a hawk or even the heavy presence of an Andean condor. This is a living eclipse. We are looking at a creature that defies the laws of modern biology. A bird that weighed as much as a professional heavyweight boxer, yet possessed the grace to navigate the turbulent thermals of the Miocene. Welcome to the Late Miocene, somewhere between 6 and 9 million years ago, where the most terrifying predator in this entire region was riding the wind hundreds of meters above your head, surveying its kingdom like it owned the sky. Because it did. This was Argentavis magnificens, and across the entire history of feathered creatures that have ever flapped a wing on this planet, none of them have ever come close to matching what this monster pulled off. Now here's the strange thing about a creature this enormous. For most of human history, we had no idea it ever existed. The bones were sitting in the dirt the entire time, baked into the dry sediment of the Pampas region, and nobody had a clue. That changed in the late 1970s, when a team of paleontologists from the Museo de la Plata, led by Rosendo Pascual and Eduardo Toni, were combing the rocks near a small stop called Hidalgo Station in La Pampa province. What they pulled out of the ground that day didn't look like much at first. The skeleton had been crushed by millions of years of pressure, the bones were fractured, and a lot of the diagnostic pieces had broken off entirely. By the time the dust settled, what they had on the table were fragments of a skull, a quadrate bone, and chunks of the legs and arms. But fragments are sometimes all you need. Within a few months of carefully fitting the pieces together, 3 things became immediately obvious. First, this was without question a bird. Second, it was a species nobody had ever cataloged before. And third, the dimensions of those leg and wing bones suggested something so absurd that the team had to keep double-checking their numbers. They were holding the remains of an animal whose true scale would humble every flying creature alive today. In 1980, Kenneth Campbell Jr. teamed up with Toni and formally described the find, giving it a name that nodded to both the country it was found in and the sheer scale of the discovery itself. Argentavis magnificens, which translates to the magnificent silver bird. Later expeditions to the region uncovered additional partial skeletons that confirmed the find wasn't a one-off freak. And the more bones came out of the ground, the more impossible the creature started to look. Trying to pin down exactly how massive Argentavis was has been a moving target since day one. When Campbell and Toni first published their official paper, they ran the numbers and arrived at a wingspan figure that genuinely shocked them. 7.5 meters across, or roughly 24.5 feet from one wingtip to the other. To put that in something useful, that's about the same wingspan as a Cessna 152, the small 2-seater plane you might see at a flight school, a bird the size of a small aircraft. Naturally, this generated a lot of attention, and over the next few years, some researchers actually pushed the estimate even higher, suggesting wingspans up to 8.3 meters, or 27 feet. Eventually, more careful biomechanical work pulled those numbers back down. Today, most paleontologists put the wingspan around 6 to 7 meters. Even at the low end of that range, we're still looking at a bird whose wings would dwarf almost any modern aircraft you can fit in your driveway. For a comparison closer to home, the wandering albatross is the current record holder for the largest wingspan of any living bird, and it caps out around 3.5 meters. So Argentavis was at minimum nearly twice as wide. Line up 2 albatrosses tip to tip, and you would still fall short. But where things really go off the rails is when you start looking at weight. The first published estimate put Argentavis at around 120 kilograms, which has since been refined down. The current accepted figure sits between 70 and 72 kilograms, or about 159 pounds. That's the weight of an average adult man, a bird that weighed as much as you do, capable of flight. To put that in proper context, the heaviest flying birds alive on Earth right now are the great bustard and the Cory bustard, and even their absolute heaviest individuals don't push past 21 kilograms. Argentavis was over 3 times heavier, with a wingspan twice as wide, and when it stood on the ground, the top of its head reached around 2 meters off the floor. So if it walked up to you, you'd be looking it dead in the eye. Now, you might have heard somewhere along the way that Argentavis isn't actually the largest flying bird that ever lived, and there's a kernel of truth to that. But like most things in paleontology, the answer depends entirely on how you decide to measure largest. There is one other contender in this conversation, and its name is Pelagornis sandersi, an extinct seabird identified from fossils dug up at the airport in Charleston, South Carolina, back in 2014. Pelagornis was a bizarre creature in its own right, equipped with a long, narrow beak lined with bony teeth like spikes for snatching slippery fish out of the ocean. And the most striking thing about it was its wingspan, estimated at around 6.5 to 7 meters. In other words, slightly longer than the modern Argentavis estimates. So if all you care about is wing length, Pelagornis technically holds the trophy. But here's the truth. Pelagornis was a seabird, and seabirds are built for endurance gliding over the ocean, which means they are extremely lightweight for their size. Estimates put Pelagornis at around 22 to 40 kilograms, barely half the weight of Argentavis at its lightest, and possibly less than a third at its heaviest. So in the courtroom of who is genuinely the biggest flying bird in Earth's history, the verdict comes down to whether you weigh wingspan or actual weight. By total mass, by overall bulk, by sheer presence in the air, Argentavis still wears the crown without much real competition. The largest, the heaviest, the most absurd thing ever to lift itself off the ground under feathered power. So what kind of bird are we actually looking at here? Argentavis belongs to a group called the Pteratornithidae, a name that basically means wonder birds. These were a small but spectacular family of large flying birds that roamed across both North and South America from the late Oligocene through the end of the last ice age, with the most recent species hanging on until just 10,000 years ago. Their closest living relatives are the New World vultures, which means if you want to picture an Argentavis in your head, the easiest starting point is to imagine an Andean condor, the biggest flying land bird alive today. Then mentally scale it up by about 2.5 times in every direction. Same general body plan. Bald or near bald head, long broad wings, hooked beak, powerful feet, just hilariously larger. But here's the twist. Most teratorns weren't built to live like vultures at all. Where modern vultures have flat, hooked beaks designed for tearing into already dead flesh, the teratorns had longer, slimmer, more eagle-like beaks that strongly suggest they were active hunters in their own right. And Argentavis was no exception. Its skull alone measured over 55 centimeters in length and 15 centimeters wide. That's a tool you absolutely do not need if all you're doing is showing up to a free meal somebody else killed. Which brings us to one of the most argued about questions in the entire field of teratorn research. What exactly was this thing doing for food? For decades, the going assumption was that since Argentavis was related to vultures, it must have lived like a vulture, endless circling above the plains, watching for dead bodies, drifting down whenever something already dying gave out. There's a more aggressive version of that theory too, where Argentavis acted as a kleptoparasite, basically a giant feathered bully that would spot smaller predators in the middle of a kill, sail in, intimidate them off their meal with sheer size, and walk away with their lunch. But the more researchers studied the actual anatomy, the harder that pure scavenger picture became to defend. The legs of Argentavis were unusually long and built for power, almost stilt-like, which is not what you typically see in a dedicated carrion bird, so a different image started to emerge. The leading theory now is that Argentavis spent a lot of its airtime cruising at altitude, scanning for prey, and once it spotted something promising, it would either swoop down and snatch the target straight off the ground, or land nearby and chase it down on foot. And here's where it gets really wild. The jaw was so flexible, and the mouth could open so wide that it could swallow prey the size of a small hair in one gulp without even having to land. Not pull pieces off, not tear, swallow whole, mid-flight if it wanted to. A wolf doesn't have a jaw that can pull off that move. There is one more extreme theory that pictures Argentavis as a full-scale aerial assassin, basically an oversized eagle that ambushed living prey from the sky on the regular, mainly because for all of Argentavis's mass, its wings were also relatively delicate. They could be damaged easily during a violent struggle, and a torn wing on a bird that needs every square inch of lift to stay airborne is essentially a death sentence. So the most likely lifestyle is somewhere in the middle. A flexible opportunist that hunted small live prey when conditions were right, scavenged when something dead turned up, bullied smaller predators off their meals when given the chance, and probably needed to put away around 2.5 kilograms of meat per day to keep that engine running. And that brings us to maybe the strangest chapter of the entire Argentavis story. Because once you understand how heavy this bird actually was, the next question hammering away at the back of your mind is, how on earth did it physically lift itself off the ground? This is a question that has consumed serious aerodynamics researchers for decades, and the math doesn't make it easy. To sustain continuous flapping flight, an animal of this mass would need to generate roughly 600 watts of power. The flight muscles of Argentavis, scaled up from related birds, could only realistically produce around 170 watts. That's not even close, which means one thing very clearly. Argentavis could not flap its way through the sky for any meaningful distance. The bird was simply too heavy, and the muscles were simply not strong enough. So what did it actually do? It became one of the most efficient gliders nature has ever designed. Argentavis lived in the air the same way modern condors do, which is to say, by reading the wind better than we read books. Its glide angle was incredibly shallow, only about 3 to 4 degrees, meaning it could lose almost no altitude over enormous horizontal distances. Cruising speed has been calculated at around 67 kilometers per hour, all without a single flap. The trick was finding rising air. As warm air bubbled up from the heated grasslands of the Argentine plains, Argentavis would slot itself into those invisible columns and ride them upward like an elevator, climbing for free, then turning that altitude into forward distance through long, lazy, almost effortless glides. But there's still the takeoff problem. Even the world's best glider has to get off the ground first. To lift off, an Argentavis needed to be moving at around 40 kilometers per hour, or 25 miles per hour. That's faster than even Usain Bolt at full sprint, and Argentavis very obviously couldn't outsprint a human. So takeoff almost certainly relied on outside help, stepping off cliffs, launching from sloped terrain, facing into a strong headwind, and letting the air do the heavy lifting. The wings themselves spanned about 8 square meters of surface area, around 91 square feet, bigger than the floor of plenty of city studio apartments. Spread that much surface against a stiff wind on a windy ridge, and even a 150-pound bird gets airborne. Once it was up, the work was basically done. Argentavis could cover huge stretches of territory, with single individuals patrolling ranges estimated at around 500 square kilometers, larger than the footprint of most major cities. Patrolling a territory that big means you need senses to match, and Argentavis was exceptionally well equipped. Its eyes were almost certainly built along the same lines as modern eagles and vultures, which means high resolution and strong magnification, capable of locking onto a small mammal or a fresh carcass from heights that to us would seem ridiculous. On top of that, it likely carried a sharp sense of smell similar to modern carrion-eating birds, the kind of nose that can pick up the scent of a decomposing animal from over a mile away, even if the body is partially hidden under brush or covered in dirt. Between the eyes scanning the landscape and the nose pulling chemical hints out of the breeze, very little died in Argentavis territory without it knowing about it. So who else was sharing that landscape? Late Miocene Argentina was a strange and dangerous place, but not really for Argentavis. The largest mammalian predators in the area were the saber-toothed sparacidonts, especially Thylacosmolus, which despite the terrifying fangs were still smaller and lighter than a fully grown Argentavis. The rest of the predator lineup was mostly small fry. Smaller sparacidonts, dog relatives no bigger than raccoons, various rodents. Nothing that would have intimidated a bird this big. There was, however, one neighbor worth being nervous about. And like Argentavis itself, it was a bird. The terror birds. 3 different species of these flightless apex predators shared the region, but only one of them genuinely outsized it. That was Devincenzia, a giant forest wrassid that stood up to 2.4 meters tall and weighed in around 350 kilograms. Basically a grizzly bear with a hatchet for a face. If an Argentavis ever found itself on the ground in front of one of those, the smartest play was to be in the air 10 seconds later. Luckily, flight gave it that exit. The terror birds were stuck on the ground and the sky was a place no other large predator could follow. Living so high up the food chain came with a peculiar consequence, which is that Argentavis didn't actually die very often. Predation was essentially off the table. Disease, accidents, and old age were really the only things that took these birds out, which means Argentavis was likely an extremely long-lived animal. We came with some estimates suggesting individuals could reach somewhere between 50 and 100 years of age, comparable to a modern parrot. And that long lifespan paid off, because when it came to reproduction, Argentavis was running an incredibly slow strategy. The bird laid only 1 or 2 eggs every 2 years, and each of those eggs weighed in at just over 1 kilogram, slightly under the size of an ostrich egg. The chicks emerged big, bold, and demanding. After hatching, the parents would tag-team feeding duty, often during the colder months, swapping incubation and food-fetching shifts every few days. The young stayed in the nest for around 16 months, an unusually long stretch compared to most living birds, almost certainly because learning to fly at this scale took serious time and physical maturation, and because hanging around mom and dad in a giant nest beat trying to survive on the ground at half size. Even after leaving the nest, the youngsters wouldn't reach full breeding maturity until somewhere around 12 years old. To keep the population stable, less than 2% of these birds could afford to die each year, which they didn't, as long as the world stayed the way it was. But the world did not stay the way it was. Around 6.8 million years ago, slightly before the Miocene officially gave way to the Pliocene, Argentavis quietly disappears from the fossil record. No more bones. No more sightings. The largest bird ever to fly on Earth, gone. And here's what makes this disappearance so strange. The wider Pteratornithidae family did not go with it. Other Pteratorns kept rolling along for millions of years afterward, with the last members of the family hanging on until just about 10,000 years ago, sharing the planet with early humans. There was also no clear extinction event in Argentina at the moment Argentavis vanished. No asteroid, no dramatic wipeout, nothing obvious to point a finger at. The leading theory ties back to climate. The Late Miocene saw a stretch of global cooling that gradually changed the structure of habitats around the world, and Argentina's open grasslands were no exception. Cooler temperatures mean weaker thermals. Weaker thermals mean less rising air, and less rising air means a much harder life for an animal that depended entirely on warm columns of moving sky to stay airborne. Add in the slow turnover of prey species as the environment shifted, and a bird that needed both consistent thermals and abundant medium-sized prey suddenly found itself living in a world that no longer offered either of those things in reliable supply. It's a quiet, almost anticlimactic ending for an animal this magnificent. But maybe that's part of the point. Argentavis represents the absolute upper limit of what evolution was willing to push a flying bird towards. The math of flight, the physics of muscles, the demand for warm air, the requirement for huge territories, all of it lined up perfectly for a brief window in deep time, and then quietly stopped lining up. Nothing has come close since. No bird alive today is even half as heavy. And given how every pressure on the planet currently runs in the opposite direction, it's entirely possible that nothing ever will. The largest bird to ever fly didn't just go extinct. It set a record that the planet itself may never let any other creature break. And that perhaps more than anything, is what makes Argentavis worth remembering.